I'm Corinne Prieto, and I started with Mobil Oil. And I was fortunate to start with Mobil Oil because I had the opportunity from day one to start using volumes of different types of data, geophysical data. And so that opened the door for basically where I am today. After 3 years, also Mobil granted me a senior grant. And with that grant, it led me to University of Toronto, where I studied with Gordon West and Gregory Gardner. At Mobil Oil, my structural modeling career, I'd say it started there when I was given the task to work with the senior programmer, John Hodge, to design and develop an interpretation scheme, a software package, you might say, very aspects that are used in interpretation. And we initially started on a twin screen, connected our terminal to the CDC computer, and soon moved into on a standalone system by Tektronix, and we moved into that realm. And I always say that the Tektronix standalone system is the predecessor to today's PC. So anyway, after 8 years, I joined the Superior Oil Company. I accepted an offer to start a potential fields group that was to service oil, gas, and mineral exploration divisions. There were 7 of them. And so I was walked into management for the first time as an exploration supervisor. One of the things that popped out as I started to develop the timeline that you were going to be using in the film was the commercialization that occurred, the buildup of the instrumentation and taking it to market. Of course, the discovery, in 1921, the spindle top, and then the torsion balance being taken and identifying that it was salt. And they wanted to do the torsion balance because they wanted to see how big the salt was. In 1922, you had the Nash Dome, which was a complete discovery due to the torsion balance. So all of a sudden, there was great interest. And these are early 20s, 30s. Then in 1939, Lacoste-Romberg literally releases their first instrument. So it became available to an industry. So from 45 to 52, you can see the birth of an amazing amount of companies, exploration companies, data brokering companies, instrumentation development, all through that almost a decade. And it's so clear, that this commercialization. Then when you look at the time outside of the gravity world, this is post-World War II, and this is the Industrial Revolution. And so fossil fuel was monumentally important. So you had the salt dome, oil, and money, and it's just so clearly in that 10 years. So that was just intriguing, okay? And then the other thing I discovered is the tenacity of the pioneers. The years that it took to refine these instruments. Again, Lacoste-Romberg, especially Lacoste, he took it all the way to 1960. He released the first one in 1939. Then you have men like George Sanders and Frank Carson. Both of those men were competitors, building airborne systems simultaneously. It's a little different, but simultaneous. One not via helicopter and one on an aircraft. But again, I met both of those men, and both of those men, a magic number, 20 years to develop it. Just the tenacity, just great. Well, you asked me what my philosophy was one day, and I have to say that it's a must. I've always believed that it's a must to know where you come from to be able to progress. And as an interpreter, you have to know where the data came from and what happened to the data before you get it. and you interpret it and have a vile confidence in your interpretation. And so what I hope is that people will be able to see where these instruments came from, how they came about, the ones they're using today. Okay, that's my hope, is that they'll get to understand that. Where they came from, why did they come, how come, who put so much time in them, and now I'm using it today. Yes, then decided that we needed to talk about the technology. And I asked Chris Nin, who had spent his career basically manufacturing the Syntrex meter. And I've asked him to talk about the technology of the instrument, also about the differences in the gravity measurements and applications. And then he's the perfect person also to talk about or give us a description of the differences between various meters, the LNR, the Syntrex, and the Warden meter.
My name is Chris Nind. I'm the Business Development Vice President of Abitibi Geophysics. I'm a geophysicist. I've been a geophysicist for about 45 years. And over that period of time, I've worked for many different companies. And including many companies that developed and built gravity meters. I first got into gravity business in 1976. It's the first time I collected gravity using a Lacoste and Romberg gravity meter up in a survey in northern Saskatchewan. The difference between a relative meter and an absolute meter, I should explain the difference here. If a relative meter or relative sensor is something you don't actually have to know the actual value of gravity. If I can use an analogy, if you are running a race and if you come in first place, you ran that race faster than the person who came in second place. But that doesn't tell you how fast you ran. It just tells you ran faster than the person who finished second place. A relative gravity meter will take a measurement at one location, a measurement at another location. It tells you that gravity is more or less at the difference between those two locations without telling you how much the gravity is actually. If on that race, then you say, well, what was my time? What was the time? How fast did I actually run? And you say, oh, you ran 100 meters in 13 seconds. That's an absolute measurement. You know how fast you ran. So for gravity, a relative gravity meter will not give you the information. You'd not tell from the length of the spring what the absolute gravity measurement is. But if you drop a ball, and if you did this in primary school, and you take a clock, and you drop a ball from a certain height, and you time the length of time it takes the ball to hit the ground, from that time you can actually calculate the acceleration of the ball from zero to the time it hit the ground. And that gives you a measure of gravity at the location, absolute measure of gravity. And that is how absolute gravity meters work. We don't have a ball now, but we replace the ball with a corner cube, which is a reflecting mirror. We replace your release with your clock with a laser, which we shine an interferometer, and we divide that. And we put a half mirror, so we divide that laser beam into two halves. One half goes up, bounces off this falling corner cube. The other half goes straight through, and we combine those two, and we look at the interference patterns. And from those interference patterns, we can calculate gravity. But the principle is the same as dropping a ball and measuring it with your watch.
is a report map that was done for the Spindletop discovery in 1926, okay? What they were after at the time, they knew they had oil, okay? They had discovered oil. And so they went back and decided to run a torsion balance. And the reason for the torsion balance is they knew they had salt, and they knew they had oil, so they wanted the gravity to tell them how big was the salt. And they were predominantly interested in a particular flank because that's where they owned the properties. So you can see the contours. The vectors are from the recordings from the torsion balance. That's the vector symbols that you see there. And then in red, there are 5 contours that take you around and bring you to there, which was their acreage that they were particularly interested in.
Perpendicular. And my prediction is...
They would be.
Yeah, the contours, right?
if this are like the Venton Dome, we saw a gravity maxima towards the center, but as you got away, you start to see the gravity minima from the deeper source. And I would assume that maybe if they had some readings further away, you'd start to see that.
Well, you see some out here on the fringes.
Yes.
That are now
Another one.
pointing in a different direction
Different direction away
and smaller magnitude.
Yes.
and smaller magnitude.
And I can imagine at that time they didn't know what the heck to think of those.
They were just wanting to know the center of mass.
I don't know.
Okay, let's start with relative gravity meters. Measuring gravity is actually based on fairly simple principles. A relative gravity meter hangs a mass on a spring. And if you have a spring and you put a mass on that spring and you measure the length of the spring, and then you hang a heavier mass on that spring and measure the length, the spring will be longer. And the length of the spring is directly proportional to the mass that's on the spring. In a so-called perfect spring, that difference is completely proportional to the mass. So you can actually, knowing the length of the spring, you can calculate the mass on the spring. That's so a relative gravity meter. If you take a spring and you hang it vertically and you hang a mass on that spring, you measure the length, and you know what the spring mass is, you can calculate the acceleration of gravity from the mass on the spring. If it's hanging straight down, that's called a straight line gravity meter. And in fact, there are several types of straight line gravity meters out there. But in order to increase the sensitivity of it, if you tip it slightly sideways, if it's on a pencil, for instance, it will fall over. And that increases the sensitivity of a gravity meter by several orders of magnitude, about 3 orders of magnitude more sensitive. So you take your pencil meter, you hang a spring on it, and you tip it over, and then you put a spring on that just to keep it there, and the length of that spring is much more sensitive than the spring that is vertical. That is the principle behind gravity meters. Both the Kosten-Romberg, which actually does have the inclined spring and the inclined angle, and the Syntrex meter, which actually uses same principle, but it's like a teeter-totter. It's a beam. It's a T-shaped beam with a mass at one end, and on the other end, in the T, you've got perfect hinges, so it's floppy. And that floppiness, you balance it with a spring in the middle, so you keep it from being floppy, and you put a charge on the mass at the end, and then you put little stops in around it, and you use feedback to keep it from moving. But the amount of feedback you have to apply to keep the mass in one location is proportional to the force of gravity, the acceleration of gravity. That's the principle behind the relative gravity meter, and the main difference between the Kosten-Romberg and Syntrex. Both types of meters are incredibly sensitive. They measure differences. They can measure differences in the Earth's gravity acceleration of gravity to parts per billion, which is absolutely, it's hard to measure parts per billion in a laboratory. It's absolutely amazing that the same sensor, same meter, can be used in the field and tossed around and with field crews and dragged through swamps and up and down mountains and not break. But they're absolutely amazing how they work. The first Lacoste and Romberg was actually built in 1939. The theory was worked out by Lucien Lacoste in his PhD thesis in 1934. And so he put it into manufacture in 1939. I started to use it in 1976. And in fact, I used G38 and 39, the 38th and 39th gravity meter that was built by Lacoste and Romberg. Over time, Lacoste and Romberg built about 1,200 gravity meters, and they stopped building them in 2004. Sintrex, first Sintrex meter was put into commercially out in the field in 1989. So there was, it didn't exist when I first started to use gravity meters. Now, the Sintrex meter is easier to build than the Lacoste and Romberg meter. And so they could build them more quickly. And as a result, the Sintrex meter overtook the Lacoste and Romberg meter in about 2004 when Lacoste and Romberg stopped production and Sintrex continued on. So now, from 2004 onwards, the Sintrex meters were being used. The main difference between those two, other than the design of the the way they measure gravity, is that the Sintrex meter is built using quartz and glass. The Lacoste meter is built using steel and a metal spring. Both types of springs work extremely well. The Sintrex, you think it would break, but it's what they put in ways to prevent the mass moving too much, so it does not break. It's called stops, and so it can't break. So the sensor is very robust. It survives some pretty good shocks. You can probably drop it on the floor, and you would not break it, which is surprising because it's more sensitive than a wine glass in terms of the Lacoste meter is a metal spring, and it's the issues with Lacoste meters is it's very difficult to make that metal spring. So the people over time, the people who could make the spring actually got old. One of the reasons why they stopped making Lacoste meters is that the people who could make them just simply got old and retired. The Lacoste meters and the Sintrex meters are both excellent gravity meters. They suffer from both have what we call drift, in that if you come back to the same location and take another measurement after using them for a day, the difference in the readings will be called drift. In terms of Lacoste meter, that drift is usually caused by what we call tears, which are bumps in the meter. It doesn't come exactly back to its original location after it's been bumped. A Sintrex meter is made out of quartz, and that comes back exactly to the same location. The reason why Sintrex meters drift has to do with recovery of quartz. Can take some time to recover. It takes time to recover to the original position, and also you get what's called adsorption or hydrolysis from the absorption on the surface from water molecules that stick to the quartz and actually change the mass. They last for a long, long time. They will not wear out. Basically, there are still very good geophysical survey contractors out there who swear up and down that it's better to use Lacoste and Romberg, and that's what they use. And then you have your whole bunch of people who think that the Sintrex meters are better. Truth is, they're both excellent.
I invited Bob Neese because he is the son of one of the major pioneers that really commercialized the gravity acquisition business. His daddy, Urban Neese, started with two other fellows, one being Rain St. James, the Tidelands Exploration Company. And they were the first exploration company with the prime directive to use gravity data to locate salt domes with the intent to drill. Later on, based on all the data he had been collecting, he opened the Neese exploration in 1952. And that business was to continue trading now data. A lot of people have been collecting gravity data, and he wanted to now start to trade his database with other databases to continue his exploration. That led to the business that Bob Neese today runs, which is the Gravity Map Service. And again, a license to rights to use the gravity data. Years later, between 1960 and 1990, the Neeses were asked by Sam Worden to service the Worden meter to the industry, and they did that for over 30 years.
I'm Bob Neese, and I operate and manage Gravity Map Service. It's a family company that's been in business since my father started it in 1952. So we're trying to continue the tradition. Neese Exploration Company was started by my father, was eventually became Gravity Map Service. It was started in 1952, like I had mentioned, and used the Worden gravity meters in the acquisition of gravity data, and also the Lacoste and Romberg meters. There was a close relationship, friendship relationship with my dad and Dr. Lucien Lacoste, and also with Mr. Sam Worden. So both meters were utilized by Neese Exploration Company when it was started. But my dad and I really, overall, we really enjoyed working together. He was an interesting person, and he probably got me involved in his business. He did not force me to join up with him when I got out of school, but I had two ways I really wanted to go. I wanted to stay in the earth science business, the geophysical business, because I like to travel. The other end is that my great-grandfather was a Texas Ranger or U.S. Marshal attached to the Texas Rangers, and law enforcement was kind of in my blood. But my dad and I worked together really well. I decided to go ahead and join up with my father. And so I was with him until his death in 1996. He actually operated the business until about 1990, and then he just kind of took it easy, but came in every day to the office. And you knew my dad, Corrine. And he loved to tell stories, and he loved to talk, but he passed away in 1996. But it was a great thing. We had a lot of interesting times when I was a kid, and he had an office in Calgary. That was quite interesting to be able to live up in Alberta and traveled around in the business, and it was great. When he got out of school, he joined up. I don't know if it was just because the job was available and presented to him or how this happened, but he grew up, and he grew up out in the country. He was always exploring and doing this thing and that, and then he was offered a job with Stanland Oil and Gas, which was a forerunner to Amoco. And he went, at that time, there was no gravity meter as such. It was torsion balance, and the pendulum type of instrument that would take all day to get 2 or 3 readings. Well, he ended up with his first job was with Stanland Oil and Gas on a torsion balance crew out of Lubbock, Texas. And then he progressed on to their offices in Tulsa, and that was how he got started in the industry. So he enjoyed it, and he kept in it. And then for better or for worse, he decided to go out on his own in 1952 with his own business. He had helped form Tidelands Exploration Company in 1945, 1945 and 1946, something in that era. But he started that up, and that's when he had partners, and he enjoyed it. He really enjoyed his work. He and John Bible, Ray St. Germain, and Steeder Jones were participants in Tidelands, and he and John Bible got together one time at the Rice Hotel, and they decided they were going to start a company. All of those gentlemen had worked with Stanlin in the early days. Some of them didn't stay in exploration work. One of them ended up being the president at LSU. Another friend of my dad that he worked with Stanlin ended up being the manager at Celanese Corporation down at Kingsville. Different areas, different careers, but these guys stuck together in the original gravity magnetic group type thing, you might say. The Warden meter was built in Houston, developed by Sam Warden, a wonderful person, a great scientist. Sam Warden attended Rice University, and his wife attended there also with him. And he worked with a professor there named Mott Smith, who also developed the gravity meter and developed the quartz springs and did a lot of work with the parts. And Sam Warden worked with his professor there. And then about 10 years later, Sam Warden went out and he started work in his garage and had his lab in his garage, and he developed the Warden gravity meter, which was a very portable instrument. And he really, it was amazing how that worked, because then he opened up Houston Technical Labs, which was there off the Kirby Drive area. And they built the Warden meters. Well, Texas Instruments had gotten wind of his Warden gravity meter, and they were at that time trying to develop a division that would provide geophysical instruments to the industry. And so the Warden gravity meter was the first product that Texas Instruments developed or purchased from Sam Warden to have in their product line. So they kind of petted and pampered it. It was a special thing for them. So they had it up until they bought that in 1953, and they had it until 1985, 1986, when Halliburton purchased all of the geophysical segments from Texas Instruments. And they produced and manufactured and serviced the Warden meter, Halliburton did, up until 1990. It took 9 months to a year to finish a meter. And what would happen is if they would get to certain points in the building of that quartz element, it was called a quartz element, it had to check out perfectly at different stages. If they may go 6 months into building that quartz element, running tests and more tests. If it didn't test out, they threw it in the trash can and had to start from day one. And so Texas Instruments even went as far as Switzerland to try to find watchmakers that would come over to work on them. But they would go through 5 or 10 people before they could find a technician that was capable of building that quartz element. Very interesting. My father said, well, look, Bob, it's up to you. He says, do you want to handle this thing and work with Halliburton on this? It's a joint effort type thing. Go for it. And I said, well, I still want to be with Gravity Map Service, and because I love the work there. But I decided, well, hey, this might not be a bad idea to keep the instrument going. There was a lot of things about this product that you had to think out pretty deeply, because just not anyone can pull people in to build the instrument. It takes about 9 months to a year to finish it. So it takes specialists, very, very kind of like watchmakers. But anyway, getting back to the meter, so hey, I decided let's work it out. I talked to Halliburton, so it worked out where we kept the meter going. And we did that until about 2015. We built in the early days that I had it, and of course I was still working alongside with Halliburton on it, but although the lab had moved out to our offices, we worked together, and we actually built some additional meters, and we serviced a lot of meters. And but unfortunately, in about 2015, 2016, we lost two of our best technicians. We didn't have there are not a whole bunch of people that know how to work on these meters or build them. So, and it takes a long time to train them. And then we lost one of the managers. So unfortunately, we had to shut it down at that time. There are still Warden meters. It's amazing. There's still Warden meters out there being used. And it's just a very interesting product. There were a lot of oil companies, independent oil operators that purchased the instruments, and a lot of the companies that had them at the time Also, there were a few companies that were doing gravity acquisition on contract that owned the instruments, and it was a worldwide event on the use of them. And there's the universities, of course, and the contractors, the industry also used the Lacoste and Romberg meters, which was also a very good meter. And so it was kind of in between the Warden and the Lacoste and Romberg. The meters with the Warden meters, Warden has exceeded, at the time of its closing, at that time, 2015, 2016, had produced over 1,500 meters. Now, that may not sound like a lot to some people in some industries, but for such a sensitive instrument and basically a limited group of people using them, that was a lot of meters. So they have exceeded any other gravity meter manufacturer as of today in the number of meters out there. I still get calls occasionally if they can have the regular service done on their Warden meters. Some of them I've had calls from universities, some have been companies. But it doesn't happen every day, but I still get calls. So I'm just assuming there's still Wardens out there being used. There have been almost 1,500 of them built. So there's still a lot of them. They're a tough instrument, but they're also, when someone uses one, and we rent instruments under the name Nice Instrument Company. We rent Lacoste and Romberg and Warden gravity. Well, we no longer rent the Wardens, but we rent the Lacoste and Romberg gravity meters. So I'm still in that area of the industry also. There are 2 or 3 full-time companies here in the States that are also still acquiring gravity data on contract.
from there, we invited Alan Herring, who worked for Mike Hall. And Alan is going to give us a little bit more discussion on the marine system and introduce us to the GPS and how it impacted the gravity exploration.
I'm Alan Herring. I'm a geophysicist. I started working in geophysics back in the 60s. I went to Stanford, which was a real handicap compared to having gone to mines. Stanford was a funny place to be in the energy business. But that's where I had my first experience with gravity meters, which I mentioned to you. Stanford had a North American meter, which weighs about 30 pounds. And as near as I can tell, and I've used gravity meters a lot, it was quite a good meter. It repeated well. It just weighed a ton. And the different meters that are around, you have in the museum a Worden meter, and they're very small and very portable, but they drift a lot. So that means you have to be running back to a base station pretty often. A Lacoste meter without the battery only weighs about 7 pounds, and it performs drift-wise just as well or better than the old North American meter did. One of the first things I did was we took the North American meter out into the hills behind Stanford and did a little survey and worked up the data, and that worked. That must have been about 1963. And then to verify the vertical gradient of gravity, free air correction, we got in the elevator in Hoover Tower and went up to the top and read on several levels. And yeah, what do you know? The vertical gradient is about 0.3086 milligauss per meter, or 0.9406 milligauss per foot. How about that for a couple of useless numbers to have in one's brain? Well, the first work that I did at GMX, we were working a lot for Freeport Sulfur Company. Sulfur exploration was pretty important. And Dr. Nettleton had been working on modeling salt domes, and I worked with him. And the trick with finding sulfur is you need to isolate the positive anomaly associated with the salt dome. And back then, not everybody believed that salt domes had any positive anomaly. They're all negative. If a salt dome has a positive anomaly, it must have cap rock. That was kind of the belief at that time. And Tom LaFair did a really cool job on a dome called Galveston 64. And that's a dome that's quite shallow. It's all salt, but it's got topography in the salt. And he was able to model it and show that, yeah, it had a positive anomaly, but that positive anomaly was all salt. Now, the way we got the top of the salt was typically with seismic refraction. And so I did a lot of seismic refraction in the Gulf of Mexico to support constraining the model to inversely determine whether it was salt or salt plus cap rock. I went to work for GMX in January 1967. And I think well, when I got there, we didn't have our own computer. I was only at GMX for almost a little less than 3 years. By the time I left, they'd gotten a Xerox computer. But before that, they were using computing services at CDC, Control Data Corporation. And Mike Hall was working there, and he did a lot of programming for Nelson Steenland and Tom LaFair. And No, Mike Hall joined GMX in March of 1967. So that's how we got to know each other. And then Mike, Tom, and I founded HeadCom at the very end of 1969. Another part of my development is that they thought it'd be a good idea for somebody to learn about these new stable platform gravity meters that GAI GMX was the first company to use a stable platform marine gravity meter. And so they sent me to Austin to learn all about it. And I sat there at Lucien Lacoste's knee for several days. And he's a wonderful teacher. Neil Clarkson was also there. Really smart people. Stable platform gravity, you don't actually null the sensor like you do with a land gravity meter. The beam is always moving, but it's damped. So what you are doing is you're measuring the net force on the beam, which is the spring tension plus a damping force. And the damping force is proportional to the velocity of the beam as it moves up and down. And if a lot of Lucien's people said, you got to average them things out. But you average that out and you get a correction to the spring tension value and a pretty good value for marine gravity. That's one of the things that Lucien, Dr. Lacoste, explained to me. Everybody called him Dr. Lacoste. Everybody called Dr. Nettleton, Dr. Nettleton. They even called Tom LaFerre Dr. LaFerre for a long time. Of course, then there was Dr. Steenland at GMX. The only guy that didn't have a PhD was the president of the company, Joe Shimmick. And they called him Mr. Shimmick. Yeah, it was a different time. They were all good, smart people. But I found out, I think I mentioned in my note to Julianne that I was telling my dad about what I was doing, learning about these gravity meters, and I mentioned Lucien Lacoste, which is kind of a strange name. He said, I know that. He said, yeah, I took physics from Lucien Lacoste back in about 1938. He said he was a hell of a tennis player. He was really renowned on the University of Texas campus for being a good tennis player. And you know, he was a big man. He was 6'3", and he was playing tennis in his 80s. David Sandwell, Walter Smith, and Haxby, I can't remember, maybe it's Bill, were pioneers in satellite gravity. And satellite gravity measurements are compared to sending a boat out to sea. Satellite gravity measurements are practically free, or at least the government paid to put satellites up and make the altimeter measurements. And from that, these guys who were pioneers, Sandwell, Haxby, and Walter Smith, were able to measure the height of the sea surface, which is a geopotential surface, and derive a gravity field from that. That gravity field derived from satellite navigation was much lower resolution than what's possible with a marine meter. And we wanted to investigate just how good it was, so I lent David Sandwell a lot of our data from the Gulf of Mexico, data that we sell. He couldn't publish the actual data, but we allowed him to publish the comparison between his data and our data. And the conclusion basically was that satellite gravity data has a resolution down to a wavelength of about 20 to 30 kilometers. That's controversial. Some people will say it's better than that. So I think most would agree that it's at least as good as the 30-kilometer wavelength at amplitudes of on the order of a milligauss. In 1983, we were doing a survey in the Gulf of Mexico, actually the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and I can't remember how the loan of the GPS equipment came together, but we were able to borrow a GPS receiver from Texas Instruments in 1983 because we suspected that GPS navigation would improve gravity data measurements at sea quite a bit, which they do and they have. GPS is, well, it's revolutionized a lot of geophysics, but our first experience with it was in '83 when there were only 4 satellites up. So you could only get a position about 4 hours a day. And we had a GPS instrument loaned to us by Texas Instruments on the ship, and it was about the size of a refrigerator, the GPS receiver. And we got really good data with it. And at the end of the survey, they offered to sell us that receiver for $100,000. And we didn't buy it, but you can kind of imagine now the GPS in your telephone is probably just as good, maybe even better than that GPS receiver that we had on the ship. We provided borehole gravimetry from about 1977 until the late 90s. So about 20 years worth. We worked with borehole gravity, and it's a very interesting measurement. It's a good measurement. The problem is that it takes a lot of rig time. So our charges for doing borehole gravity were small compared to tying up an oil rig for a day. So you got an oil rig that costs $200,000 or $400,000 a day, or even more, offshore. And even a land rig costs a fair amount of money. Borehole gravity measurements are small, are slow. Borehole gravity measurements are slow and therefore expensive just because of the rig time and the crew time that it takes. The value of it is that it's a deep investigation density measuring tool. And it was recognized early on by Amoco as seeing gas deposits just away from the wellbore. So if there was a low density anomaly 5 or 10 feet from the wellbore, you could frack into it. So there were other applications, but that was the application, I guess, that really kind of got it going commercially, is a way to locate bypassed gas and sometimes oil in an oil well and frack at that point and produce the oil. But yeah, Edcon was involved in borehole gravity for probably more years than anybody as a contractor. We weren't the first, but I'd say that our activities were pretty much pioneering, and it was just it was difficult to make a business out of it because there wasn't enough business, and we finally sold our meters to Mike G. Lacoste.
Louise Sanders. Now, she is at the helm of Sanders Geophysical, and she is the daughter of another pioneer, George Sanders. And he told me, I was fortunate to meet him one time, and he told me that he had spent 20 years in developing the adapting, shall I say, the LNR gravity meter to go airborne, and which he did in 1997.
My name is Louise Sander. I'm co-president of Sander Geophysics. The other co-president is my brother, Stefan Sander. It's a family business that was started by my father in 1956. My dad was working all the time in airborne geophysics. So my father started Sander Geophysics in 1956. He had obtained a PhD in geophysics in Germany before he came over to North America. Then he worked for a few years in United States in oil and gas exploration, moved to Canada, did more work in oil and gas and mineral exploration work before he decided to start his own company. He's always been interested in technology and instrument development. So at first, he was doing some ground geophysics, but he felt that, First, he was working on ground geophysics projects, but he felt that airborne geophysics was the way to go, and Canada was in the forefront of developing airborne geophysics. So he worked with some engineers and technicians that he had hired, all of them excellent engineers and technicians, to develop an EM system, an airborne EM system, and an airborne magnetometer. He first purchased a helicopter to do some airborne work, and then eventually moved into fixed wing surveying. Currently, Sander Geophysics has 10 fixed-wing aircraft and 2 helicopters that we use for airborne surveying all around the world. We like to say that we've surveyed in every continent, including Antarctica. So we feel that's quite an accomplishment. Anyways, back to my dad. He felt that airborne gravity was something that Sander Geophysics should get into. It was something that no other company was doing, and he saw there was a big gap in the market. And along with our chief research engineer, Steve Ferguson, they developed the system. And as I said, it took about 10 years of hard work to get it to actually work. There's a lot of software, a lot of hardware. We first tried it on the ground in a van before we put it into the first aircraft. And then since it's been working, so since the early 2000s, our aircraft system has been active continuously, and it really is the system that has kept our company active and alive because it's something that only our company offers. He was a very astute businessman. He understood what was going to be good for the company. He also was a very good judge of character. So he liked to give people a chance. He hired a lot of new immigrants to Canada, people that were very intelligent and didn't have a lot of experience, but he felt they could fit into our company and contribute to our company. My father had a very classical education. He learned Greek and Latin and so on. And he kind of regretted that when he went to school, a lot of the things that the young people were learning in math, like, for instance, about matrices and the engineering techniques, that wasn't invented when he went to school. And he felt that it would have been nice to learn those sort of things. So, of course, he learned them through experience and so on. But he was very classically educated. As a teenager, my first job was as a cook in a remote field camp in northern Saskatchewan. So that sort of got me interested in the business throughout university. And after I graduated with my undergrad degree, which was in applied math, I worked on data processing at Standard Geophysics. And then I did a master's degree in computer science. And so I started doing coding for geophysical applications. So for the data processing that we do with all the data that we acquire. After a while, I started supervising all the data processors, and eventually when my father retired, my brother and I became co-presidents of the company.
It is Dan DeFrancisco, and he started his career with Lockheed Martin. And we've asked him, or we've targeted him, to discuss the gradiometry instrument, okay, and how it developed or where it is today. I've also asked him to give us some insight on what he thinks is the near future of the gravity instrumentation and the gradiometry instrumentation.
Well, my name's Dan DeFrancisco. I've worked for my own company, which is called Niagara Gravity Consulting. I started that in 2020 after I had worked with Lockheed Martin for about 34 years. My career really started, and really by training, I'm an engineer. I spent the first 15 or so years of my career doing instrument design and development, support and program management type things. And then later in my career, I spent time doing business development, marketing, and contacts with clients and customers and so on. So got into gradiometry because when I was hired by what was then Bell Aerospace, a division of Textron in the mid-'80s, they were developing some gravity sensing systems for the U.S. Air Force and for the U.S. Navy. So I was hired into that program to be a lead mechanical engineer and to help design some of that equipment. Yeah, gravity gradiometry, it essentially gives you a higher spatial resolution, smaller distance, higher fidelity information than you would get with just scalar gravity. A gradient is a spatial rate of change. I often try to think of it in practical terms that we might appreciate. A lot of people don't appreciate the fact that gravity changes. Oh, it's everywhere the same. Well, it's really not, due to a lot of things. But I often think of a map of the United States in the summer or the winter. And in the summertime, you see a really hot area down in the southwest, Arizona, Southern California, and so on. You see rather cooler temperatures up in the northeast, which is where I live. So you see a gradient of temperatures across that large span. Well, gravity is similar to that. Gravity gradients are, in the sense that they change. They vary over spatial distances. And the ability to measure that gives you good insight and information into what's happening in the geology subsurface. Gravity gradients, they're tough to measure. As a matter of fact, some would say that it is the weakest force, and gradient measurements are the highest precision measurements that we make of any type. It's done using accelerometers today. There have been historically different ways to measure gravity gradients. Going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, torsion balances were used with weights and suspended wires and such to measure it. But today, all of the gravity gradiometers that are deployed and practically used use accelerometers. And they take precision accelerometers, which measure acceleration, and they look at that acceleration difference over a distance. Again, we're looking at a gradient, which is a change of something, some parameter over some spatial distance. And so at Lockheed Martin, we've developed these instruments. We incorporate accelerometers. We incorporate some other system techniques into this. We rotate the disc with the accelerometers on it to modulate the signal. So there's a lot of neat things that are done to be able to extract that gravity gradient measurement. Now, all that sounds okay, pretty straightforward, but then you have to think of the fact that you're going to take this instrument measuring these infinitesimally small signals and put it on an aircraft, put it on a marine vessel that's, shaking and bouncing and moving all over the place. and still be able to resolve the information that you're looking for. It's a pretty daunting task. Through just a little bit of the history of the gravity gradiometer development, as I mentioned, the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy back in the mid-'70s into the early '80s saw needs for measuring gravity gradients for defense purposes. They wanted to measure the characteristic of the gravity field at launch sites for intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they wanted to use information to help navigate undersea. And so there's a lot of money, a lot of effort put into developing these gravity gradiometer systems. In the mid-'90s, after the Cold War ended and there was a peace dividend and peace broke out around the world, the Navy and the Air Force really didn't need this capability so much anymore, so it became declassified, and then essentially you're sitting here with a really good capability that needs an application. And so contact with mining companies, with exploration companies revealed that, hey, this would be a really important thing, a beneficial thing for natural resource exploration, hydrocarbons, minerals, etc. So that initial Navy Air Force development, which was funded by a significant amount of money, got us to the point of, say, step one. And then subsequently, that same equipment has now been transitioned into aircraft, into shipborne systems, and so on, with continual improvement. So over the last 25 years or so of commercial deployment of gradiometers, we've seen significant beneficial improvements, probably an order of magnitude in improvement in noise power and in resolution capability. A lot of that due to instrument engineering, a lot of it due to improvements in data processing, a lot of it just due to experience and knowing, what affects these measurements.